Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to go over a review of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, adding in elements of the Keynesian view and neoclassical view of how this model works. And the big idea here is that the kind of culmination of a macro principles class is this model, this long run aggregate demand, short run aggregate demand, aggregate supply, short run, long run view, where we can see how output and unemployment and inflation react to different mechanisms in the economy. And so this is a great opportunity to review aggregate demand and aggregate supply, look at how to graph it, and also it's a great way to add in this next layer of the Keynesian view and the neoclassical view. And we want to remember that Keynes's big idea here is that the macroeconomy adjusts slowly, and that we see the aggregate demand effects driving not just output but prices, and comparing that to the neoclassical view. And the neoclassical view is going to give us kind of another side of how to address this model. So the neoclassical view is going to be looking more at the emphasis on the unemployment factors, on the idea that government borrowing to try and solve a recession might cause more problems than it's worth. And really the big difference between these two views is how they view wages, whether they're sticky or not, and what the role they view of fiscal policy, whether or not the government should be acting in response to recessions or not. With the Keynesian view saying, yes, if a government's borrowing, it's going to help offset things and help kind of solve the economy with government spending, even if it's at the cost of some government debt. Whereas the neoclassical view is a little bit more of this idea that, hey, these are really problems that will solve themselves, and that the government doing a bunch of deficit spending, running a big budget, that's going to crowd out private investment and create more problems further down the road. And so the idea is here that the neoclassical view is more like, hey, the cure causes the next cold, because of the fact that a lot of times the Keynesian perspective on, hey, let's use aggregate demand to shift that up and get us out of the recession is going to end up reducing future investment and future growth and cause the next recession, basically. So what we're going to do is I will flip the screen and show you what the assignment looks like. There's a couple of questions. We're going to look at kind of actually graphing aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which I think is kind of fun. And then we'll look at the idea of how a recession would affect these models and affect this graph. And I'm doing what I like to do, which is I've got a kind of silly example here, but to me that makes it a little more fun, and gives us the opportunity to play around with these ideas and kind of think about this in a fun way. So let's go look at the assignment on my other screen. It'll probably show up right there. And there it is. So here's our assignment, looking at aggregate demand and aggregate supply, but now also adding in the dimensions of the Keynesian and neoclassical view. So what we're going to do first is look at this table that shows aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and the price level. And we want to graph this just the same way we would a demand and supply curve, right? We've got values for the value of all the goods and services demanded by our country, and the value for the supply of that given a certain price level. And so we want to compare those and pop those up in a graph. We do want to be a little bit careful with the scale if we can help it. And then we want to talk a little bit about, okay, where's the equilibrium? Where is aggregate demand equal to aggregate supply? What's the price level there? What kind of slope are we seeing on these curves? What that tells us about inflationary pressure from future growth, and that kind of thing. And so we want to go ahead and graph that out. And then part two is where we start to really play with stuff. It's where we really want to play with what the difference is between the neoclassical perspective and the Keynesian perspective. So first what we'll do is we'll talk about what a recession would do to this economy. In this case, I'm saying that the recession is being triggered by super intelligent frogs invading, forcing everyone inside. We're going to expect that to result in things like decreased consumption expenditure, decreased investment expenditure, and probably decreased net exports, just as people clamp down, feel bad about the economy, have anxiety about the future. They're not going to want to be spending, starting new businesses, those kinds of things. So the standard expectation is all those factors are going to shift that aggregate demand curve in to the left as people respond to bad news, something scary, reduced shopping, those kinds of things. So we want to graph that and then look at what happens to the price level, output, and unemployment on the X and Y axes. And then we want to talk about what would happen if wages are sticky and prices are sticky. What is going to, whose perspective is that linked up with? Is that more Keynesian or neoclassical? Which perspective is going to assume this to be something that won't affect long-term growth versus who might think it would affect long-term growth? And then just kind of an example of how these two perspectives are different in terms of what they might see in this recession, but also what they might see as a solution to this recession. So I'm going to get on the whiteboard behind me and get started graphing this, and let's see how this problem works out. Okay, so we want to get started by graphing our output or our GDP down here and our price level up here. And we've got a lot of space to work with, and we want to try and be pretty well scaled. So our aggregate supply and aggregate demand are going to be contained within a GDP of between 600 and 770. So I'm going to go ahead and just not include the first $599 of GDP and start out here with 600, and that little gap's going to be an articulation of that change. And then I'm going to go 620, 640, 660, 680, and then 700. And you do want to kind of try to be careful with this stuff, with the scaling. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you do want it to make some decent sense and be something you can work with. The price level's a little simpler. It's just going to go 110 to 170. So again, I don't need to graph those first 100, but we'll go ahead and just put in 110, 120, 130, 140, 150, 160, and 170. And since I've got the space, I'll put 180 in too, although I won't use it. And then I'll go ahead and start by graphing aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is going to start out right here with 110 and 60. And then when the price level goes up to 120, aggregate supply is going to go up to 640. At 130, it's going to go up to 680. At 140, it's going to go up to, I believe, 720. Yep. At 150, it's going to go up to 760. And then at, where'd I go? I lost it. 640, 680, 720. And then it starts to slow down, 740. And then at 160, it's just to 760. And then at 170, it's even closer. It's at 770. And so what we can see here is we're starting to see aggregate supply get steeper at the end, right? As the price level is increasing in tens, aggregate supply goes from increasing by 20s to by tens, telling us it's getting steeper. And that's one of the things we want to think about is as aggregate supply gets steeper, that means we're starting to exceed our capacity, and we're going to start feeling inflationary pressure from increases in output. Now we can throw aggregate demand up when the price level is low at, say, 110. Aggregate demand is going to be relatively high at 700, but as the price level increases, aggregate demand is going to decrease. We're going to have 690 here, and then 680, and then when the price level is 150, aggregate demand is going to be 660, 160 price level, 650 aggregate demand, and the slope of aggregate demand stays pretty much the same all the way through, changing, by tens. And so then the next question asks what our equilibrium is. What is the equilibrium price level, the equilibrium level of output? And that's going to be right here. Equilibrium level of output is 680. That's sort of the GDP for this country in equilibrium. And the equilibrium price level is going to be 130. What could we say about this economy? Well, we could say that it seems like it's in a pretty good spot. We can see that there is inflationary pressure up here, but not yet. The economy can grow before it starts to experience a lot of inflationary pressure. So now we've got that graph and we can talk about the equilibrium level. Now we get to part 2, the invasion of intelligent frogs forces people to stay inside, and they're going to be spending less money on consumer goods. We're going to see a recession. And when we see a recession, we are going to expect a decrease in consumer spending and a decrease in investment spending. Firms are going to be buying less stuff. People are going to be buying less stuff. If it's an international recession, other countries might buy fewer of our goods. But overall, that's going to mean that we're going to see a decrease in GDP, which will lead to a shift in of aggregate supply. Or sorry, goodness gracious, not aggregate supply, no, aggregate demand. Because remember, those are the factors that shift aggregate demand. So that's going to push aggregate demand in to a lower level. Maybe now we're at aggregate demand is equal to, let's say at 120 and 640 maybe, or maybe it's here in the middle, something like that. What's it going to do to the economy as a whole? Well, we're going to see a decrease in output, a decrease in the price level, and we're going to expect an increase in unemployment, or you could call that a decrease in employment, right? Fewer people are going to have jobs. We're going to have some unemployment as a result of the shrinking economy. So this is going to affect the model by shifting aggregate demand in, lowering the price level, lowering output, increasing unemployment. Now we get to the part where we talk about sticky wages and whose idea prevails. So if we have sticky wages and sticky prices, what does that mean in terms of whose perception of the macroeconomy is in play? We want to remember and think about what's the big difference between Keynes and the neoclassical view. What are the differences between the Keynesian view and the neoclassical view? How are they the same? So if we see wages be sticky downward, that's going to be in alignment with Keynes's view. Slow to adjust prices and slow to adjust wages is in line with Keynes's view, and it's going to trigger a lot of unemployment rather than, and this is what we talked about when we talked about labor markets, right? Rather than lower wages to get the labor market in equilibrium, we'll see layoffs triggering unemployment, and that can have a negative effect, right? If more people are being laid off, we can expect this to go down more. If people stop buying stuff, we might expect this to go down more and more unemployment. We can see how these things can be a vicious cycle. On the other hand, if we believe that this recession is just a blip, and as soon as the highly intelligent frogs move on, the economy will return to its normal status, its normal level of productivity, that's the neoclassical perspective. The idea that these are short-term effects that don't need a lot of intervention, and the economy will correct itself in time. That's more neoclassical perspective. And so if we are believing, if we agree with that, that's the belief that these are not going to actually affect our growth. These frogs are temporary. Frogs have a very short lifespan. The lifespan of our economy is longer. Then that's going to be a neoclassical perspective. And in terms of the difference between these two, The big difference is what we should do. The big difference here is that the Keynesian perspective says, hey, this is bad and it's going to hurt people. So what we have to do is increase government spending or lower taxes, and that will shift aggregate demand back out and solve the problem faster. The neoclassical view, on the other hand, says that's dangerous. That's dangerous because it's going to grow a budget deficit that has to be paid for in the long run. And government borrowing it gets back to that national savings identity. If we have more government borrowing, that's going to mean more deficit spending, higher interest rates, less access to credit. That might influence investment spending. It might influence our long-run growth. And we could also face inflationary pressures if aggregate demand shifts out too far because of that government spending. And so the neoclassical perspective is much more of a this is going to solve itself, leave it be kind of perspective. And those are the big differences there. So that's kind of what I wanted you to take away from this, is a little bit of a review of how this model works, and also another edition of how do neoclassical economists and Keynesian economists view this. And there are lots of economists on both sides of this argument, and there's lots of good reasons why you might agree with one side or the other. Really, it's just an interesting way to dive a little bit deeper into aggregate demand and aggregate supply and get a better sense of how the macroeconomy works. So that's it for this graphing problem. Let me know what questions you have, and I'll see you next time.